See, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So I'm going to present this report, An Equitable Phase Out of Fossil Fuel Extraction, which was published during COP28 by the Civil Society Equity Review. The Civil Society Equity Review is a coalition across civil society. It was founded in the run-up to the Paris Summit in 2015, founded by the organizations in the bottom right of this slide. And since 2015, it has tried to develop a civil society consensus on what would be a fair way to address climate change. There's been at least one report every year. Last year, there were two reports at the COP, one on fossil fuel extraction and the other which on the more traditional area that the review has focused on since Paris, which is reducing territorial emissions in a fair way. Over the last 2 or 3 years, the Civil Society Equity Review has increasingly looked at fossil fuels. And this particular report was signed on to by over 200 organizations worldwide who are listed on this slide. As Cece said, the report reflects the inputs of very many people. It goes back to 2016. Since then, we've had a number of convenings of civil society, both in person and online. We've had one-to-one consultations with a lot of people and organizations. We've had written comments on various drafts. And this is a process which is ongoing. We don't in any way see this report as a final word on this subject. Actually, we strongly encourage you and invite you to give your feedback, both in this webinar and beyond. So please do feel free to email us with any thoughts that arise for you, any reactions. We're also quite open to doing webinars for your organization, for your networks, perhaps in some regions with simultaneous interpreting. So please do get in touch if you'd like to work with us to make something like that happen. And through these discussions, our aim is to keep improving our framework. So what we're trying to do is propose in this report and in this framework is to propose a fair way to transition away from fossil fuels. At COP28, Sultan Al Jaber said, "Show me the roadmap," and we're happy to oblige. Our starting point here is that a fair framework for phasing out fossil fuel extraction needs to be fair for everyone. It needs to be fair for fossil fuel workers, fair for fence line communities, for public sector workers and users of public services that are funded by fossil fuel revenues, by farmers and fishers and others who are affected by the impacts of climate change, by people who are energy poor. What we're trying to do is create a framework that addresses multiple dimensions of justice. And to structure that, we propose 5 principles for how to think about the fair phase out of fossil fuel extraction. The first of these is that where fossil fuel extraction violates human rights through pollution, through seizure of land, through militarization, etc., it should be stopped urgently. A good example of that is the Amazon, for instance, the Yasuni National Park in Ecuador, or another example is the Niger Delta in Nigeria. The second principle is that the pace of phase out at a global level needs to be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And that's determined by the science. In our framework, we use the IPCC's low energy demand pathway as a guide. But how do we share this aggregate global pace between countries? Different countries have different circumstances. And our key principle here, and this is a fundamental concept in our framework, is that in some countries, especially where there is some level of economic or societal dependence on fossil fuels, phasing out too fast will cause social impacts. It will cause people to lose their jobs, or it will cause a loss of public revenues to fund public budgets. And these will have social impacts. And where those social impacts are greatest, the phase out should be slower. Where countries can do so without having these social impacts, it should be faster. So that's the third principle. Fourth, the cost of the transition needs to be shared fairly according to capacity to pay for it. And finally, in each country, there needs to be a just transition for workers and communities, in which those workers and communities have a central role in designing and owning the process of that transition. Now, I think for people on this call, the first and fifth principles are probably fairly well understood, the human rights and just transition. So I'm going to focus mainly on the other three, and especially on the third and the fourth. Starting with a global pace of phase out consistent with 1.5 degrees. There's now strong scientific evidence that there is no room for new fossil fuel projects if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This graphic, which is from last year's emissions gap report, it shows the lifetime emissions from already existing fossil fuel infrastructure if operated over its full economic life. And as you can see, it would blow the 1.5 degree budget several times over. What this means is that a large number of coal mines, gas fields, oil fields need to be closed down early before the end of their economic life, and we don't have space to add more. These bars in the graph are already too large. Now, the reason for that is it's to do with the urgency of the problem and just how small the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees is. It's about 6 years worth of present global emissions. So things need to move very fast to move away from fossil fuels. Some people argue that new producers should be allowed their turn to develop fossil fuels, countries like Senegal or Uganda or Suriname. And the argument goes, these countries have made a very small contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. They have very pressing developmental needs. And so this argument says the phase out needs to be faster in wealthier countries to create space for new countries to become producers and gain the benefits from them. I think we would agree with half of that, but not the other half. We would agree that wealthier countries need to do more, but we would argue that not only is development of new fields and mines to extract fossil fuels no longer viable from a climate perspective, nor is it a viable pathway to development, especially today. And that's for three reasons. The benefits from fossil fuels are not well shared. Fossil fuel extraction can impede development at a local level. Secondly, the resource curse. And thirdly, the legacy of stranded assets and liabilities. And all three elements of this are very well illustrated by the LNG development that's currently going on in Mozambique. So while some in the government and some business people do stand to benefit from the gas, the people living nearest the onshore facilities, many of them have lost their land, experienced a worsening in conflict and militarization. Even before the major revenues have started to flow into Mozambique, there is already what some people are calling a pre-resource curse, where the country's public debts have spiraled upwards, and we've seen some major corruption scandals. And although the gas in Mozambique was discovered more than 10 years ago, the first serious revenues to go to the Mozambican government will not happen until the mid-2030s. And by that stage, we hope and intend global consumption of gas will be in rapid decline and much lower than it is today. And a consequence of all of this is that we're seeing a chaotic and mismanaged process in Mozambique, with most of the benefits flowing out of the country to foreign companies and investors. And for these reasons, we in the Civil Society Equity Review, we don't see fossil fuel extraction as some finite benefit that has to be shared fairly between countries. For many people, extraction is not a benefit at all. Instead, we focus on the process of transition. We're not allocating the remaining fossil fuel extraction. We're trying to fairly manage the social impacts of the process of transition. And there are two main elements to that are highlighted in our principles 3 and 4 that I showed you earlier. Firstly, countries that depend on fossil fuel extraction will face greater social impacts if they transition too fast, impacts on the workers, on the revenues, on energy supplies, and so on. And secondly, countries with the lowest capacity will require international support to enable a just transition. And to summarize our framework in its simplest form, we're trying to create a framework that enables a just transition for everyone, who's affected by fossil fuels and their phase out. So let's look at how this works a bit. This shows two of those key concepts, dependence and capacity, plotted on a two-dimensional graphic. Countries to the right that are more dependent on fossil fuel extraction will need more time to phase it out. Countries at the bottom that have lower capacity will need more international support to enable their just transition. I think we tend very often to think about the top left and bottom right corners of this graphic, most commonly as typifying respectively the global north and the global south. Now, so what I want to emphasize here is that we're not proposing a framework that uses that single one-dimensional categorization into all the countries go into two groups, north and south. Instead, we're looking at the specific characteristics country by country. And so, of course, we have many wealthy global north countries that have to phase out quickly and don't get support. And conversely, we have poor global south countries that are highly dependent and need more time. But perhaps less intuitive are the other two corners of this graphic. So in the top right, we have wealthy countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuel extraction. A good example here is Kuwait. Because that Kuwait's economy is so entangled in the oil business, it will take time to disentangle it and build alternative sectors. But Kuwait is such a wealthy country that there's no question of it getting international support to do that. Conversely, in the bottom left, we have poor countries with low levels of fossil fuel dependence. Because they don't depend heavily on fossil fuels, they're capable of phasing out quite quickly, but on condition that they get ample support to enable that. So this next graphic tries to show that same thing a bit more practically. We look at a couple of dimensions to illustrate this. What you see on the horizontal axis is the share of government revenues that comes from oil and gas. The red line is the IMF's definition of resource dependency. So countries with more than 20% of their revenue coming from, in this case, oil and gas, are considered resource dependent. And the further right countries are on this graphic, the more difficulties and the more social impacts they will have from phasing out fossil fuel extraction. Because fossil fuel extraction provides a significant share of revenues, it's that funds public sector salaries, that funds public investments, even investments to enable the transition. It funds public services. And so too rapid a transition will deprive people of jobs, salaries, services, investments, etc. Added to which, there's a catch-22 here, which is the more dependent a country is on fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel revenues, the harder it is to reduce that dependence. And that's because dependence creates structural barriers to transforming the economy. And so, there are about 25 countries that depend on oil and gas for more than 20% of their revenue. Of those, about 15 or so depend on oil and gas for more than 50% of their revenue. So they're very highly dependent. And then you've got some extreme cases like Libya, Iraq, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, where it's more than 80%. So these are absolutely fundamentally dependent on oil and gas. On the vertical axis, you have the country's incomes that's shown on a logarithmic scale here. And that's because what we're trying to illustrate here is that one dimension of dependence is the resources you have to manage it and overcome those challenges. And so wealthier countries, even with the same level of revenue, will be considered less dependent than those with equivalent levels of revenue dependence, because they have resources to overcome that, for instance, by investing in alternative sectors. So let me show you briefly how the mechanics of our model works. Firstly, how do we differentiate timelines for phase out? So this is how we think about the concept of dependence on fossil fuels. We look at 3 dimensions of dependence on fossil fuel extraction: as a means to supply domestic energy needs, as a source of government revenues, and as a creator of jobs. We combine those 3. We then scale this according to a country's capacity to overcome that dependence, the resources it has available to enable a transition. And from these, we generate phase-out timelines. We have a global average phase-out timeline, which is determined by the science, and we adjust that. For more dependent countries, we make the phase-out slower than the global average. For less dependent countries, we make it faster. Here's the other part of the framework, which is equally important, which is how do we fairly share the costs of phase out according to the fourth principle. Here we use two familiar concepts, capacity and responsibility, and we make an estimate of the total amount of support needed globally, and then we share it in proportion to capacity and responsibility, just as we do when we're talking about territorial emissions. So let's move on to what are some. I've described how our framework works. What are the results that come out of it? First, let's look at it at the global level. Here is the global phase out of the three fossil fuels. As I said before, this is consistent with the IPCC's low energy demand pathway, but we've applied our dependence indicator to determine the phase out pace for each fuel in each country. One thing to highlight here is this is a really rapid pace of phase out globally. Global production of fossil fuels decreases by about 50% by the end of this decade, and by about 85% by 2035. And you just have a fairly thin tail after that for the last of the phase out in the most dependent countries. So this is a rapid transition, and it has to be because of the arithmetic of 1.5 degrees. Let's zoom in and look at what this means country by country. Now, we treat each of the three fossil fuels separately. So this first graphic is for oil. And what we show here is on the horizontal axis, this is the year that in our framework, a country stops extracting oil. And we've defined that as when its extraction falls below 10% of its current level. So that's the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we show countries' capacity. Now we're doing something a bit more sophisticated than just showing their income, because we're taking into account progressivity, that a dollar means more to a poor person than it does to a rich person. And so our measure of capacity here is it's a per capita capacity, the average per person excess income that a country has above what people need to meet their basic needs. And so countries are plotted against that on the vertical axis. That blue line in the middle, that's the global average per capita capacity. What we're saying is that any countries that are below that global average, they should get some support to enable their phase out. And the further below it they are, the more of their phase out costs should be covered by international support. Above that line, any country that has more than the global average per capita capacity should be a provider of support to others. So I'm going to quickly talk you through some of these countries, and I'll start in the top left and go around the graphic clockwise. So in the top left, we have countries which have very low levels of dependence on oil extraction, countries like Canada, Australia, the United States, the UK. Also in this category, we have Norway, which, although it has a significant level of dependence on oil revenues and to a lesser extent jobs, it also has one of the highest capacities in the world to overcome those challenges. And so when that's scaled in to the process, the overall dependence of Norway is reduced compared to what it would otherwise be. So these countries, in our framework, they phase out very early, very soon after 2030, so in 6 or 7 years' time. And because they have high capacity, they're wealthy countries, they are significant contributors of support to those below the line. Let's move rightwards. As we move rightwards, we're seeing more dependent countries stay above the line for now, but we see countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Now, their economies are very dependent on oil, and because of the difficulty of shifting away from dependence, and because it takes time to build alternative sectors, we give them more time in our framework until the late 2030s, in Kuwait's case, the early 2040s, in Saudi Arabia's case. But as I said before, because they're wealthy countries, they are still contributors, not recipients of support. Now, in the top right there, these are meant to be just off the timescale. These green markers, these are countries that don't extract oil, countries like France and Switzerland, but which are wealthy countries with above average capacity. And these countries contribute to the overall support pot. They don't have anything to phase out of their own because they don't extract oil, but we still expect them to contribute support because, after all, climate change is a global problem that we have to solve together, and all of these countries benefit from consuming fossil fuels, even if not producing them. Let's move down to the bottom right, and here we see the most dependent countries. You remember from earlier, Iraq and South Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, Libya. This is where the phase out will be most difficult. And so we've given these as much time as we possibly can while still staying within the 1.5 degree budget. And so we've given them till 2050 to effectively end their production. And that only becomes possible by making other countries early. So that first group that we put them in the early 2030s, that's to create space for more time to phase out where it is most needed. These are also countries with low capacity, extremely low capacity in the case of South Sudan. So they will need international support to enable this phase out. And even on this timescale, phasing out by 2050, I think it will be exceptionally challenging. That's less than 30 years. And given such high levels of dependence, I think people might react to our early 2030s for Canada and the US as a shockingly soon and early and demanding ask. I think actually it's a more difficult ask for Iraq or South Sudan to phase out in 25 years than it is for Canada or the US in 7. And so moving around, we have some others that are quite close to them, Angola, Ecuador, the Congo, etc. But let's move to the bottom left, which is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of this graphic. Here we have countries like Thailand, Uzbekistan, India, which have a low level of dependence on oil extraction. And because they have a low level of dependence, it shouldn't be too hard to phase it out. However, because these are poor countries, they have much higher priorities to spend their resources and their efforts. And so, of course, they're not going to prioritize phasing out oil production, even though it's a relatively small factor within their economies. And so this illustrates just how central support is to our framework. These countries, we believe, can phase out quickly on a similar, in the least dependent cases, on a similar timescale to the first group we talked about by the early 2030s, but only if they receive support. It wouldn't work without that support. And some people in the global north, in particular, tend to focus on timelines as the key element of what we need to talk about in terms of phase out, and they kind of push support aside as a difficult political issue that they don't want to think about too much. And we would challenge that point of view, because I think for many southern governments, and this is especially illustrated in the bottom left corner of this graphic, it doesn't even make sense to think about phase out without thinking about the means by which it is carried out, and that requires support. So we've also got graphics for gas and coal, which I'll go through much more quickly because they have the same structure. One thing I'll highlight, this one's for gas, one thing I'll highlight here is that we've treated each of the fossil fuels differently, separately, because countries have different levels of dependence on extracting each of them. Here's an example. Trinidad and Tobago is not dependent on oil extraction, but is highly dependent on gas extraction. So it has an early oil phase out date and a late gas phase out date. Moving on to coal, again, the same kind of structure. And we can zoom into this in the discussion. In fact, we'd really welcome your feedback on how does this look or play in your country contexts. One thing I'll highlight here is that even the slowest countries to phase out coal move faster than is the case in oil and gas. For instance, South Africa, just after 2040, is the last to phase out coal in our framework. And the reason for that is that coal is not a significant generator of government revenue, at least compared to oil and gas. And so really, we're just using 2 of the 3 dimensions of dependence in this case, on jobs and on energy supplies, and not on revenues. And so that's why coal goes faster in our framework, because it's a fewer dimensions of dependence. Now, what these graphics show you, they show you the timelines on the horizontal axis. They also show you which countries are contributors of support and which need to receive support, depending on whether they're above or below the line. Now, to fully estimate support, we need to think about what is the cost of transition. And to do that properly, we would have to carry out a bottom-up country needs assessment. That's a serious process. It needs to be carried out with a full democratic consultative process, and that hasn't been done. But we've made a very rough estimate based on a small number of studies that are available and also policy frameworks that are available. And we've come up with a rough lower bound estimate for how much support is required in the countries that need support. And our estimate is at least $200 billion per year, US dollars. And in this table, we've proposed how that should be shared, the provision of that support between the countries above the line. You'll notice probably that the United States carries a very large share of that. And that's because we're sharing it in proportion to capacity. How much surplus wealth does the country have, or surplus income, and responsibility for past emissions. And the United States has a large share of both, and so ends up providing close to a half of it. But the European Union, also a very large portion, Japan, and so on. Now, just some initial thoughts in this next slide about how we'd like to think about refining the estimates of costs. There are different types of costs which can be suited to different types of financial instruments and require different kinds of processes at the national level. But I also want to highlight that I've talked about financial aspects of support. There are also important non-financial aspects of support: capacity building, technology transfer, but also reform of international institutions. For instance, investment agreements that require governments to pay compensation to fossil fuel companies for the effects of climate policies on their profits. Those are a serious barrier and need to be reformed as part of this overall package. So to conclude, as we see it, there's no right to extract fossil fuels. There are rights to have basic energy services, to have your needs met. There are rights to employment, to a clean environment, and so on, but there's no right to extract fossil fuels. And given both the urgency of the climate problem and the lack of contribution that fossil fuels can make to development in the context of a transition, fossil fuels should be phased out as quickly as possible everywhere, and in all countries it should begin decreasing right away. However, as quickly as possible differs from country to country, and in countries that are more dependent, as quickly as possible will take longer. And another key point that I've highlighted is that phase-out timelines and international support are absolutely inseparable. It doesn't make sense to think about one without the other.